The rope was already swaying in the dry October wind when Ruth Beckett noticed that the tall stranger at the edge of the crowd was the only soul in Caldwell, Kansas, who had turned his face away. It was the autumn of 1878, and public hangings in Caldwell drew the same kind of crowd that a county fair might produce: merchants leaving their storefronts unlocked, ranchers riding in from 20 miles of flat prairie, children perching on fence posts for a better view, and women pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths while they watched with wide, hungry eyes. There was a ceremony to it, a civic gravity that the town of Caldwell wore like its Sunday best. Justice, they called it, a reckoning. The sheriff had announced the execution of one Cole Danner 3 days prior, and the notices had been tacked to every post and beam from the stockyards to the general store. Ruth had not wanted to come. She had told herself she was only walking past, that she had business at the dry goods store on the far side of the square, that she was not the sort of woman who attended such things. But the crowd had thickened around her before she could make her exit, and then the platform was visible, and then the man with the hood was led up the stairs, and she had been rooted there against her better nature. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher who had arrived in Caldwell the previous spring to fill the position left vacant by old Mr. Harmon's bad lungs. She had dark red hair that she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, a habit of direct eye contact that made certain men uncomfortable, and hands that were slightly ink-stained from marking her students' work. She was not timid. She was not given to fainting or flinching. But something about the particular silence that fell over the crowd in the moment before the trapdoor opened made her feel cold all the way through, in spite of the warm October sun. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the gathered townspeople, slightly apart from the rest, one broad shoulder leaning against the corner post of the harness shop. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean through the jaw but solid in the chest, wearing a dark canvas coat that had seen considerable weather. His hat was pulled low, and he had the particular stillness of a man who knew how to occupy space without drawing attention. But what struck Ruth, what stopped her mid-breath, was the simple fact that while every other face in that square was turned toward the gallows platform, his face was turned toward the ground. His jaw was tight. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were slightly curled. He was not praying. He was not squeamish. He looked, Ruth thought, like a man absorbing a blow that no one else could see. The trapdoor fell. The crowd exhaled in a collective sound that was half gasp and half satisfaction. Ruth looked away from the gallows at the same moment the stranger did, and for a single unguarded second their eyes met across the width of the square. She made her decision quickly, the way she made most decisions that mattered, without excessive deliberation and without apology. She moved through the dispersing crowd, threading between men in work shirts and women in calico, keeping her eyes on the corner of the harness shop where he was already straightening, preparing to leave. She reached him before he could disappear into the side street. "Excuse me," she said. He stopped, turned. Up close he was more tired-looking than she had noticed from a distance, with the particular kind of tiredness that comes from the inside rather than from a shortage of sleep. His eyes were dark brown, the color of creek water in late summer, and they held a wary quality that softened fractionally when he registered that the person addressing him was a woman in a schoolteacher's dress rather than a deputy with a question. "Ma'am," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "You were the only man at the hanging who looked away," Ruth said. She was not accusatory. She was genuinely curious, and she had learned long ago that the only reliable way to satisfy genuine curiosity was to ask the question directly. "I noticed. I wanted to know why." He looked at her for a long moment. The crowd was still moving around them, breaking into small groups, voices rising into ordinary afternoon conversation as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than a slight interruption in the business of the day. He seemed to be deciding something. "I knew that man once," he said. His voice was low and careful, like a man placing his words where they wouldn't cause damage. "Not well, but enough." Ruth held his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, as if he had braced for a different response, and her sincerity had caught him unprepared. "Emmett Carver," he said, and offered his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who had been raised with manners but had spent enough time alone that they'd grown a little rusty. "Ruth Beckett," she said. "I teach the school on Maple Street." "I know which school it is," he said. "There's only one." "That's true." She paused. "Will you be in town long, Mr. Carver?" He glanced toward the now empty gallows platform, where two men were already beginning the business of dismantling the morning's work. "I'm not sure," he said. "I came to pick up some work. There's a ranch east of here, the Hollies spread, that's looking for a hand to take them through the winter. I was going to speak to them today." "The Hollies Ranch is a good operation," Ruth said. "Mr. Hollies is a fair man. His wife is one of my students' mothers. She brings me preserves at Christmas." She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. It seemed important to give him something in return for what he had given her, which was honesty at a moment when most people reached for deflection. He almost smiled. It was a small, unfinished thing, but it was there. "That's good to know," he said. They stood for a moment in the odd intimacy of two strangers who have already exchanged something real. Then the harness shop's proprietor opened his door and the bell above it jangled, and the spell broke, and they were simply two people standing on a dusty sidewalk in Caldwell, Kansas, with the afternoon still ahead of them. "I hope the work suits you," Ruth said. "I hope your students give you no trouble," he replied, and there was a warmth in it that she carried with her all the way to the dry goods store and all the way back home to her rented room above the Morrison family's kitchen. She thought about his face when he looked away from the gallows. She thought about the way he'd said, "I knew that man" once, as if the knowing itself were a weight he'd been carrying for some time and had not yet found a place to set down. She thought about him more than was strictly sensible for a woman who had exchanged perhaps 40 words with a stranger. She told herself it was the schoolteacher in her. She was professionally disposed to find people interesting, and when asleep with the sound of the October wind against her window and her lamp still burning over the stack of arithmetic papers she hadn't finished marking. The Hollies Ranch was 6 miles east of Caldwell, along a road that rutted badly in wet weather but was manageable in the dry. Emmett Carver arrived there in the early afternoon, spoke to Warren Hollies for the better part of an hour in the man's kitchen while Hollies' wife, a brisk and cheerful woman named Me, made coffee and pretended not to listen, and left with the understanding that he would start on Monday morning and be paid in room, board, and a fair monthly wage through to the spring. He found a room at Caldwell's only boarding house in the meanwhile, a narrow bed, a window facing the alley, and a washstand that wobbled if you leaned on it. He'd slept in worse places, considerably worse, and he arranged his few belongings with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned not to spread himself out too much in spaces that weren't his. What he could not arrange, with the same efficiency, was the particular quality of the afternoon's events in his mind. Cole Danner. He had known Cole Danner in the years after the war, when Emmett had been 22 and drifting through Texas with no particular destination, and Cole had been running cattle in a loose, semi-legal fashion that nobody looked at too carefully if they didn't want to be implicated in anything uncomfortable. Cole had not been a bad man in those days. He had been a reckless one, which was different, and he had possessed a particular charm that made people forgive him things they would not have forgiven in a less appealing man. Emmett had ridden with him for about 8 months before the situation with a man named Garrett Clay, and a disputed card game had made it advisable for Emmett to go elsewhere. He had not thought much about Cole Danner in the years since. People you knew in your drifting days had a way of becoming theoretical over time, half-remembered, more story than substance. But seeing the notice with Cole's name on the hanging post, and then actually standing in that square and hearing the trap door, had made Cole Danner unexpectedly vivid again, alive in the specific way that the dead sometimes become, just at the moment of their dying, as if the mind protests the finality with a sudden rush of detail. He had not wanted to watch. He was not ashamed of it. What he had not expected was the schoolteacher in the ink-stained dress who had come across the square to ask him why. Ruth Beckett. He turned the name over in his mind the way you turn a coin over to check both sides. There had been something very direct about her, a quality of attention that was not aggressive but was entirely unafraid. Most women, most people, would have looked at a man turning away from a public hanging and either assumed the worst of him or politely ignored the anomaly. She had come over and asked. He found that he liked that considerably more than was probably wise, given that he was about to start work on a ranch 6 miles outside of town and had no particular plans beyond surviving the winter and figuring out what came next. The following Sunday, which in Caldwell meant church at 9 and leisure at noon, Emmett found himself at the general store, replacing a belt buckle he'd lost somewhere on the road into town. The store was run by a man named Archie Potts who had opinions about everything and shared all of them freely with anyone who paused long enough in front of his counter. Emmett had just finished agreeing that the winter looked to come early based on the thickness of the caterpillars' coats, which was the sort of folk meteorology he had encountered in every small town he'd ever passed through, when the bell above the door rang and Ruth Beckett came in with a list in her hand and flour on her mind. She saw him immediately. He saw her see him, and then she did the thing he had already come to think of as characteristic of her. She simply looked directly at him and said, "Mr. Carver, you're still in town." "I start at the Hollies Ranch tomorrow," he said. "Good." She turned to Archie Potts and consulted her list. "Archie, I need 20 pounds of flour, a pound of sugar, some baking powder, and whatever dried beans you have that aren't too old." "Got a fresh shipment in Thursday," Archie said, already moving. "You planning on feeding an army, Miss Beckett?" "I'm planning on baking for the school's fall gathering next Saturday," she said. "The children are performing songs for their parents. I offered to provide the refreshments, which means I have approximately 40 people to feed and my own funds are modest." "I could carry that for you," Emmett said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It came out simply, without strategy, the way things did when you were out of the habit of calculating. She considered him for a moment. Not long. She was not the kind of person who deliberated unnecessarily, but the moment was real. "It's several blocks," she said. "I wouldn't want to take you out of your way." "I don't have a way to be out of," he said. She almost smiled, and he noticed that when she almost smiled, a small crease appeared at the corner of her left eye that had no equivalent on the right, which gave her face an agreeably asymmetric quality. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked the several blocks to the schoolhouse, which was where she kept her supplies when she was doing school-related baking, and he carried the flour sack over one shoulder and the smaller parcels in the crook of his arm, and she walked beside him with her hands free and talked about her students. She taught all grades together in the one room, 17 children ranging from 6 to 14, and she spoke about them with a specificity and warmth that told him she knew each of them properly, not just their names and their level of reading, but the particular texture of their individual difficulties and gifts. "There's a boy named Thomas Wren," she said, "who is the worst reader I've ever tried to teach and the best mathematician I've ever encountered. He can do calculations in his head that would take most adults 10 minutes with a pencil. But he holds a book upside down sometimes without noticing, and every time I realize what he's done, I have to turn away so he doesn't see me struggling not to smile." "Does he know he does it?" Emmett asked. "I think he knows more than he lets on," she said. "He's 9 years old and already more strategic than half the adults in this town." They had reached the schoolhouse. She unlocked the door, and he carried the supplies inside, setting them on the long table at the back where he could see the marks of 100 children's palms worn into the wood. The room smelled of chalk dust and wood shavings, and something faintly sweet that might have been the remnants of a previous baking project. He set the flour down and turned to find her watching him take in the room. "What do you think of it?" she asked. He looked at the neat rows of slates on the desks, the carefully lettered alphabet cards pinned above the chalkboard, the small bookshelf with its organized volumes, the map of the United States tacked flat and straight on the eastern wall. "I think it looks like someone cares about it," he said. "Considerably." "I do," she said, without any false modesty. "I didn't come all the way from Ohio to do it halfway." "Ohio," he said, "that's a long way." "It is. I came because they needed a teacher and I needed somewhere to go." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as if she had simply assessed the available options and made the most logical choice. "My parents had both died, my mother in the spring before I came, my father the previous winter. I had no siblings, no particular ties. The advertisement in the newspaper was specific: a furnished room, a salary, a community. It seemed like an honest offer." "And was it?" "Largely," she said. "The room is less furnished than the advertisement suggested. But the salary is reliable and the community is real. People here are," she searched for the word, "solid. I mean that in the good sense. They have weight to them, permanence." "I've been looking for that," Emmett said, and then stopped, surprised at himself for saying it aloud. She looked at him with that direct quality that he was beginning to understand was simply the way she operated. She paid attention fully, without the social fiction of only pretending to listen. "How long have you been looking?" she asked. "Since about 1872, he said. "So 6 years, give or take." "That's a long time to be moving," she said gently. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." The afternoon light was doing something golden through the schoolhouse windows, catching the dust motes in the air, and making the whole room look briefly like a painting of something that mattered. He was aware, in a way he hadn't been aware of anything for quite some time, of the specific quality of this particular moment, this woman, this room, this town, this strange new feeling of being somewhere he might not immediately want to leave. "Mr. Carver," she said. "Emmett," he said. "Please." "Emmett." She said it naturally, as if she'd been saying it for years. "Would you like to come to the school gathering next Saturday? Parents are welcome, and I don't see any reason a friend of the school shouldn't be equally welcome." "Is that what I am?" he asked. There was nothing improper in the question. He was genuinely asking, with genuine interest in her answer. She considered it with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "I think you might be," she said, "if you wanted to be." He started at the Hollies ranch the next morning before dawn, and the work was straightforward enough: mending fence lines, moving cattle to the winter pastures, mucking out the barn, and doing the dozen other physical tasks that a spread of that size required coming into the cold months. Warren Hollies was a quiet man who communicated primarily through nods and the occasional specific instruction, which suited Emmett fine. He was given a bunk in the hands' quarters, a warm enough space with 4 other men who were decent enough and minded their own business after supper. He worked hard that week. He had always worked hard. It was the thing he did reliably, the anchor that kept him from drifting entirely. But this week there was a particular satisfaction to it, a sense of the work leading somewhere rather than simply occupying the days until he moved on. He found himself, during the slower moments of fence mending and cattle sorting, thinking about Ruth Beckett in the schoolhouse with her ink-stained hands and her list in her pocket, and her way of asking the question you hadn't expected anyone to ask. On Saturday he rode into Caldwell in the middle of the afternoon, cleaned up as best he could with the limited resources of the ranch hands' quarters, and arrived at the schoolhouse at the time she'd mentioned to find it transformed. The desks had been pushed to the walls, someone had strung paper decorations from the rafters, and approximately 40 people were crowded into a space that normally held 17 children and 1 teacher. The children themselves were arranged in a ragged but determined row at the front, wearing their cleanest clothes and expressions of concentrated terror. Ruth was at the edge of the room, speaking to a woman who had brought her baby and was managing both the conversation and the infant with the divided attention of an experienced mother. She saw Emmett come in and her face opened, not a smile exactly, but a brightening, the way a lamp turns up when you adjust the wick. She excused herself from the baby-managing woman and came to him. "You came," she said. "I said I would. People say they will all the time and don't." "I'm not good at many things," he said, "but I'm reliable." She looked at him with that steady attention. "That's not a small thing," she said seriously. The children sang, with varying degrees of success and enthusiasm, 4 songs about harvest and home and the coming winter. Little Thomas Wren, the mathematical prodigy, turned out to have a surprisingly clear tenor voice for a 9-year-old and sang his parts with total commitment, his eyes fixed on the middle distance as if he were performing for an audience considerably larger and more sophisticated than a room of Kansas frontier parents. Ruth watched her students with a mix of pride and tenderness that she made no effort to disguise, and Emmett watched her watching them and felt something in his chest shift, like furniture being rearranged in a house long thought empty. Afterward there was food Ruth's baking, which turned out to be exceptional, the kind of skillful plain cooking that requires genuine talent to produce and informal milling about, and Emmett was introduced to Warren Hollies' wife, Me, who looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had been watching over her schoolteacher like a maternal hen and was deciding whether he passed muster. "You're working at our ranch," Me said. "Since Monday," he confirmed. "Warren says you're a good worker." "Warren doesn't say that about many people." "I appreciate the work," he said. Me looked at him, then at Ruth, who was cutting a pie on the other side of the room, then back at him. The look conveyed about 30 seconds worth of complex social information in approximately 2 seconds. He received it, understood it, and thought that Me Hollies was probably an excellent judge of character. He helped Ruth stack the empty dishes afterward, when the room had cleared, and the last of the parents had gathered their children and gone home in the blue November dusk that was beginning to settle earlier and earlier each day. It was a comfortable sort of work, moving around the same space, her washing and him drying with the school's rough towels, and the conversation came as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years. She asked him where he had grown up, and he told her a small place in Missouri, a farm, his father and mother and 2 older sisters, all of them gone now to time and distance, and the particular dispersal that the war had accelerated in so many families. He had fought in the war on the Union side, been 19 at the start of it, and come out the other end different in ways he hadn't had the language to fully articulate then and still struggled with now. She listened without filling the silences with reassurance, which was the thing he most needed from a listener and most rarely got. "The man who was hanged," she said quietly, "Cole Danner, was he from that time?" "After it," he said. "The drifting after." He was quiet for a moment. "He was not a bad man when I knew him. I don't know what happened in the years between." "People change," she said, "sometimes in ways that aren't recoverable." "Yes," he said, "but you still carry the version you knew, the one that was, I don't know, alive in a different way." She set down the dish she was holding and turned to look at him fully. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what you mean. My mother, before she got sick, she was so present. So entirely herself. And then the illness changed her, took pieces of her before the end came. I still carry the whole version. I think you always do." They stood in the quiet schoolroom with the evening pressing against the windows and the lamp burning warm between them. And something passed between them that was not yet declared, but was entirely real, a mutual recognition, the sense of 2 people discovering that the territory inside the other person is not foreign country, but something they have been looking for without knowing what it was called. "I should let you lock up," he said, because the moment had become something that needed to be moved away from carefully, like stepping back from the edge of something significant. "I suppose you should," she agreed, and she was not entirely steady in her voice, which told him the moment had been the same thing for her. He rode back to the Hollies ranch in the cold dark, and the stars over Kansas were extraordinary in the way they always are when you're far from any city lights, enormous and indifferent and somehow also intimate. And Emmett Carver, who had not made a real plan for his own life in 6 years, began, cautiously and with considerable inner argument to think about making one. November deepened. The work at the Hollies ranch was harder in the cold, the ground freezing at night and thawing imperfectly through the short, bright days, the cattle requiring constant attention as the winter pressed in from the north. Emmett developed a rhythm with the work, and with the other hands, a man named Saul Briggs, who was 50 and had been working ranches all his life and knew every trick, and two younger men, brothers named Pete and James Navarro, whose family had been in that part of Kansas since before it was a state. The four of them got along without friction, which was not something to take for granted in close quarters. On his days off, which were Sundays and the occasional free afternoon when the work allowed, Emmett found his way to Caldwell. He told himself it was for the general store, or for the barber, or simply for the company of people in a number larger than four. He was honest enough with himself to know that these were secondary justifications. He saw Ruth on those Sundays, sometimes by arrangement and sometimes by the simple luck of a small town where there were only so many places a person could be. They walked, which was the most available form of companionship in a town where formal courtship required the approval of family that neither of them had locally. They walked along the main street and out toward the edge of town, where the prairie began its flat, enormous run toward the horizon. They talked with the easiness of people who had somehow skipped several of the preliminary stages and arrived at a place of real conversation, discussing everything from the school board's latest penny-pinching decision about textbooks to the political situation in Washington, which Ruth followed with a sharpness of opinion that she deployed without apology. She lent him books from the small school library, serious things, a collection of essays, and a novel by a woman named George Eliot that he read in the evenings by the ranch's lamp and found unexpectedly moving. He returned them with opinions, which she received with delight and often argued with, and those arguments were some of the best conversations he'd had in years, conducted over the course of several Sundays in the specific shorthand that develops between people who have been paying close attention to each other's thinking. She told him about her life in Ohio, not unhappily, but with the clear-eyed acceptance of someone who had processed the losses and moved through them. Her father had been a schoolteacher too, which was where she'd learned the work, and her mother had been a woman of considerable practical intelligence who had run the household with the same rigor that other women in her neighborhood applied to church attendance. Ruth had inherited both qualities, her father's love of learning and her mother's practical grasp, and the combination made her formidable in ways she seemed slightly unaware of, which was part of what made her so interesting to be around. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. About Missouri and the farm, and the way his father's hands had looked, permanently darkened from the soil, and how he'd thought as a boy that those hands were the most reliable things in the world and had been shocked, in the way only a young person can be shocked, to discover that they weren't enough to hold the world in place. About the war, in pieces and careful installments, not the violence of it but the particular loneliness. The way 100,000 men could be crammed into the same valley, and each one of them be entirely alone with himself. About the drifting afterward, which had been both freedom and punishment, the landscape changing but the interior remaining stubbornly the same. "What are you looking for?" she asked him one Sunday in late November when they were standing at the edge of town watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the flat western horizon. The wind was sharp and she had her coat pulled close, her hair doing something complicated in the gusts. He thought about it. "I don't know if looking is the right word," he said. "I think I've been more waiting." "Waiting for what?" He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, that direct and unafraid attention. "I'm beginning to think I've been waiting for a reason to stop moving," he said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence he could remember in a very long time. "Emmett," she said, "Ruth, I think you should know that I think about you considerably more than I probably should, given that we've only known each other 6 weeks. He felt something loosen in his chest, some long-held tension releasing. "I think about you considerably," he said. Full stop. Without the qualification. She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and the sound of it in the cold November air was one of the best things he had heard in years. "That's a very direct statement," she said. "You've established that directness is welcome," he pointed out. "I was following your example." She looked at him, and the lamp in her eyes was warm enough to feel from where he was standing. "I think I like your example better," she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand, which was in its glove, and she let him hold it, and they stood there in the last light watching the Kansas sky go from gold to rose to the specific deep blue that comes just before dark. And it was, he thought, the most entirely right thing that had happened to him in a very long time. December came in with ice and bluster, and the work at the Hollies ranch intensified as the cold deepened. There were cattle to move, pipes to thaw, feed to distribute across distances that felt considerably longer when the wind was coming hard from the northwest. Emmett worked with the focused energy of a man who has found that his work is taking him somewhere, that the effort is building towards something rather than simply occupying time. He and Ruth had settled into a courtship that the town of Caldwell observed with the thorough attention that small towns apply to any romantic development. Mee Hollies reported this observation to her husband with approval. Archie Potts at the general store beamed whenever either of them came in and made remarks of transparent cheerfulness. The sheriff's wife, a forthright woman named Clara Teague, stopped Ruth after church one Sunday in December and said, without preamble, "That Carver man is a decent one. I've asked around. Nobody's got anything bad to say about him, and believe me, I asked specific." Ruth reported this to Emmett the following Sunday with barely concealed amusement, and he received it with an expression that combined gratitude and mild embarrassment in a way that she found extremely appealing. On Christmas Eve, Warren Hollies gave his hands the evening free, and Emmett rode into Caldwell in the cold dark and knocked on the door of the Morrison family's house, where Ruth had her room above the kitchen. Mrs. Morrison, who had the kind disposition of a person who has organized her life around feeding and sheltering others, answered the door with a lamp and called up the stairs for Ruth with unnecessary loudness. Ruth came down in a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, and her hair was down, actually down, loose to her shoulders, which was not a thing he had seen because she wore it pinned at school and pinned when they walked, and the difference was striking enough that he forgot briefly what he'd come to say. She looked at him looking at her, and her cheeks went pink, which was its own kind of spectacular. "Mrs. Morrison insisted I dress properly for Christmas Eve," she said. "I told her we were just going for a walk." "We are just going for a walk," he confirmed. "She implied that wasn't sufficient justification for leaving my hair down." "Mrs. Morrison is a wise woman," he said, and Mrs. Morrison, who had not left the hall, made an approving sound and disappeared back into her kitchen. They walked to the church, where carols were being sung by a small volunteer choir, and stood in the back because all the pews were full, and listened to the voices carrying the familiar words into the rafters. The candles made the whole interior warm-looking, golden-edged, and Ruth was standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cold air. And somewhere in the middle of the second carol, he simply reached down and took her hand again, and she immediately threaded her fingers through his as if this had been arranged in advance. Afterward they walked back through the town, which was quiet and cold and strung with whatever Christmas decorations the various households had managed: evergreen boughs over doorways, candles in windows, the occasional handmade wreath. Their breath made small clouds in the freezing air. "Emmett," she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. He was not alarmed. She had a tone for serious things that was still very much her clear, direct, and it did not sound alarmed. "I have been offered a position," she said. "In Wichita, a larger school, 2 rooms, a better salary. The letter came last week." She paused. "I haven't answered it." He stopped walking. She stopped because he had. They stood in the middle of the empty main street with the cold stars overhead and the distant sound of a piano from the saloon 3 blocks away. "Why haven't you answered it?" he asked. She turned to look at him fully, and in the starlight her face was clear and steady and entirely herself. "Because I wanted to talk to you first," she said. And because she started again. "Because there are things about being here that I did not expect to find and that I am not certain I could find again in another place." "Ruth," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer. I have my wages, my horse, and whatever I can save between now and spring. I don't have land or a house or a family name that means anything in this part of the world. I've spent 6 years going nowhere in particular, and I'm 31 years old, and Emmett," she said firmly. He stopped. "Did I ask you to make an inventory of your deficits?" she said. "No," he admitted. "I am telling you that I have been offered a position and that I haven't answered it because of you. That is a specific statement about what I feel, not a request for a list of reasons why you might not be suitable." Her directness was, as always, exactly calibrated to the situation. "I'm not asking you for a house or a family name. I am asking you," she paused, and for the first time he saw something uncertain in her, something careful and exposed. "I am asking you whether you intend to stay." The question hung in the cold air between them. "Yes," he said. No inventory, no qualification. Just the word, and behind it every intention he had formed over the past 6 weeks and the clarity that had been building in him like water behind a dam, waiting for the moment to be released. "Ruth, yes, I intend to stay. I intend," he took both her hands in his. "I want to build something here. I don't know all the particulars yet. But I know it involves you, and I know it involves stopping. And I know I haven't wanted anything this specifically since before the war. And I know," she stepped forward and kissed him. It was brief and cold-nosed and entirely perfect, there on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas on Christmas Eve, 1878, with the stars overhead and the piano playing 3 blocks away and the whole flat prairie dark and enormous all around the small lit town. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright and her cheeks were fully red now, and she was smiling in a way that made the crease at the corner of her left eye deepen into something definite. "I'll write to Wichita in the morning," she said. "Write a kind letter," he said. "They don't deserve a rude one." She laughed and took his arm, and they walked home in the cold, and the future, which had been for so long a formless and slightly threatening thing on Emmett Carver's horizon, began at last to take on a specific and welcome shape. January was the hardest month on the Hollies ranch. As it always was, a depth of winter reckoning with the reality of livestock and frozen ground, and the sheer physical demand of keeping things alive in temperatures that dropped well below freezing in the nights. Emmett threw himself into the work with everything he had, not just because the Hollies family was fair to him, and the work was honest, but because he had begun to think of this winter as a foundation, the unglamorous, essential work on which something lasting could be built. He had 2 conversations in January that shaped the next months considerably. The first was with Warren Hollies, on a frozen Sunday afternoon when the other hands had gone into town, and Emmett had stayed behind to fix a fence section that had been damaged by a drifting steer. Warren came out to help, which was typical. Warren Hollies was the kind of ranch owner who did not consider himself above the manual work of his own land, and they worked together in comfortable silence for a while, and then Warren said, "Me tells me you've been courting Miss Beckett." "Yes, sir," Emmett said. Warren drove a post with 2 efficient strokes. "Good woman, smart, takes care of those kids at the school like they're her own. She deserves someone with plans." "I have plans," Emmett said. "They're not fully formed yet, but the general direction is clear." Warren looked at him with the expression of a man assessing whether a fence post is properly vertical. "I own a section of land east of here that I've been thinking about what to do with. Had a homesteader on it, man named Purvis, but he gave up in the drought and went back to Missouri. It's got a house on it, small but solid, good, well, about 160 acres. I've been thinking about selling it to someone who'd use it well." Emmett straightened and looked at Warren. "At what price?" Warren named a number that was significantly below what the land was probably worth, which told Emmett several things about Warren Hollies, and all of them were good. "I'd take a note for part of it if your savings aren't sufficient," Warren added. "Paid out of wages over time. I trust a man who works like you do." "I need to think about it," Emmett said carefully. Not because he hadn't already made his decision, but because he had someone else to consider in the decision now, and that consideration was not a burden but the most pleasant thing he could imagine. The second conversation was with Ruth the following Sunday, when he laid the proposition out for her over coffee in the Morrison kitchen. Mrs. Morrison had taken to providing them coffee and then tactfully absenting herself, which was its own form of endorsement. He told her about the land, the house, the price, the arrangement with Warren. He told her what his savings looked like, and what the note would cost him monthly, and what he thought he could realistically grow and run on 160 Kansas acres. He was precise about it because she was precise and would have found anything less thorough an insult to her intelligence. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he had finished, she said, "What are you proposing, Emmett? The land or something larger?" He had not planned to do it this way, in a kitchen over coffee with the February wind at the windows, and Mrs. Morrison's preserves on the shelf, and no particular ceremony to the moment. But he had learned in the past months that Ruth Beckett valued honesty above ceremony. "Both," he said, "the land and the something larger if you'll have me." She looked at him across the table. Her hands were around her coffee cup. Her eyes were absolutely clear. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed, actually laughed, which was a sound he produced less often than he would have liked but which came out now with complete freedom, and she smiled at the sound of it, and Mrs. Morrison's voice came through the kitchen wall from the parlor. "I heard that. Congratulations." They were married in March, when the first real warmth was beginning to coax the Kansas prairie back to life. The ceremony was at the small Methodist church that Ruth attended, performed by the Reverend with a formal thoroughness that satisfied the community's expectations. Warren and Me Hollies came, and Archie Potts closed the store for an hour, and Clara Teague, the sheriff's wife, arrived with an enormous jar of preserved peaches as a gift and cried during the vows, which she seemed not to consider remarkable. Several of Ruth's students stood in a row in the back of the church in their best clothes, and watched with the solemn intensity that children apply to occasions they understand to be important. Emmett wore a jacket he'd had made at the tailor's in Caldwell, dark wool, fitted properly, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Ruth walk toward him on Me Hollies' arm. Since she had no family locally, Me had offered with characteristic directness, and Ruth had accepted with her own characteristic practicality, and the sight of her in the pale blue dress she had made herself, with her hair pinned but loose at the front in the way it was when she was in a good mood, was something he tucked away in the deepest and most careful part of his memory. She arrived at his side and looked up at him and said, quietly enough that only he heard it, "You look terrified." "I look like a man who cannot believe his luck," he said. She took his hand. "Neither can I," she said. The Reverend performed the ceremony with the kind of quiet dignity that Emmett had not known to want from a wedding until he was standing in one. The words "to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, until death do you part" were not new words. They had been said in this church and every church before it since before either of them was born. But standing here, holding Ruth Beckett's hand, Ruth Carver, as of the moment the Reverend finished the final words, they felt new. They felt, in the way that the most durable things feel, entirely necessary. The Purvis house, which had sat empty through the cold months, came to life in April. Ruth threw herself into it with an energy that was recognizably her, organized, purposeful, finding pleasure in the making of things. She bought curtains at the general store and made them longer with an additional strip of matching fabric. She reorganized the kitchen shelves with the same systematic logic she applied to the school's bookshelves. She planted a kitchen garden in the plot behind the house with seeds she'd been saving since February, and stood in the spring sunshine, looking at the freshly turned earth with the expression of someone contemplating a very long project they are entirely equal to. Emmett worked the land through the spring, putting in crops with the methodical attention he brought to all physical work, repairing the barn's east wall, digging out the blocked drainage on the north side of the house. He was helped, on the first serious week of field work, by Saul Briggs, who had finished his time at the Hollies Ranch and was between positions. Saul came out for the week as a favor and an act of affection. He had a soft spot for Emmett that he expressed exclusively through practical assistance rather than anything verbal, and the two of them got more done in 5 days than Emmett could have managed alone in 3 weeks. In the evenings, which came later now as the spring stretched the days, Emmett and Ruth sat on the small front porch of the house and watched the sun go down over the flat Kansas horizon, and the conversations were sometimes about the farm and the school and the practical texture of their life, and sometimes about books she'd brought home or things her students had said that day, and sometimes about nothing in particular, comfortable silences in which they were simply together in the last light. Ruth continued teaching through the spring term, riding into Caldwell on the horse they'd acquired, a sturdy and agreeable bay that she had named Patience, which she said was both descriptive and aspirational, and returning in the late afternoon with the particular energy of someone who has spent the day in close contact with 17 different kinds of growing mind. She talked about her students the way a gardener talks about plants, with attentiveness to each individual's specific requirements and a baseline love for the whole endeavor. One evening in early May, she was quieter than usual, and he noticed. "Something happened today," he said. It wasn't a question. She was quiet for a moment longer, her eyes on the middle distance of the prairie. A meadowlark was going through its repertoire somewhere nearby, the sound dropping in and out on the warm wind. "There's a boy new to the school," she said finally. "Josiah. His family came in from—" She paused. "He's 8. His father works at the stockyards. He came to school yesterday, and the other children—" She stopped again. "We're unkind," he said quietly. "Children can be very particular about who belongs and who doesn't," she said. "I addressed it, directly and thoroughly, but the look on his face before I got there—" She shook her head. "He reminded me of myself at that age. The particular look of someone trying very hard not to show that it hurts." Emmett set down the piece of harness leather he'd been mending. "How is he today?" "Better. I put him next to Thomas Wren, who does not have a conventional social bone in his body and will talk to anyone about mathematics with equal enthusiasm. By the end of the day they were arguing about whether 7 or 11 was more interesting as a number, which I took as a good sign." Emmett smiled. "Thomas Wren," he said. "I haven't met him properly. You'll meet him at the summer gathering," she said. "He's going to perform a demonstration of mental arithmetic, and I am genuinely not sure if the parents will be impressed or unsettled." "Both," he said confidently. She laughed, and the meadowlark obligingly provided counterpoint, and the evening settled warm and easy around the house and the two of them on the porch, and the world was, on that particular May evening, an almost embarrassingly generous place. In June, Ruth told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before he went out to the fields, standing at the kitchen table with her coffee. She said it simply and directly, as she said all things, but her hands on the coffee cup were not quite steady, and the look in her eyes was something he hadn't seen before, a mixture of joy and what he recognized as awe, the particular quality of awe that comes from discovering that the future contains something larger than you had known how to imagine. He set down everything he was carrying, his hat, his gloves, the leather strap he'd been taking to the barn, and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her. She pressed her face into his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Are you all right?" he said finally into her hair. "I'm absolutely fine," she said, muffled. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "I'm just very happy and very aware that I should not take this for granted, and she laughed slightly unsteadily. "I am a woman who normally has command of the relevant vocabulary, Emmett, and I appear to have mislaid it." "I have command of nothing at the moment," he told her. "I am entirely incapacitated." She looked at him and he looked at her in the morning kitchen light, and they were both grinning in the foolish and entirely justified way of people who have discovered that the life they are building is larger than the one they thought they were building, and the foundation is holding, and the walls are straight, and there is, impossibly, more room than they expected. The summer passed in the fullness of good work and good company. The crops came in better than the cautious projection he'd made in the spring. The Kansas soil was generous when it was properly tended, and the season had been kind with rain. He sold the surplus grain in Caldwell and put the money toward the note with Warren Hollies and toward the additional costs that a baby coming in February would require. Ruth taught through the summer term and into the fall, stubbornly refusing to be managed by anyone who suggested she ought to be resting, though she accepted Hollies' visits with their accompanying casseroles and practical advice with genuine gratitude. Had 4 children of her own and dispensed wisdom about pregnancy and childbirth with the brisk confidence of proven experience. Ruth received this wisdom with the same systematic attention she brought to all information, making mental notes and asking follow-up questions that sometimes made me blink. "She's going to be an excellent mother," reported to Warren. "She's already treating it like a field of study. Heaven help that child. It will be the most thoroughly educated infant in Sumner County." Emmett heard this secondhand through Warren, who reported it with a straight face that barely concealed his amusement, and repeated it to Ruth, who was not remotely offended, and said, Hollies is an astute observer." The fall was golden and enormous, the prairie in its amber and ochre October colors. Emmett repaired the roof before the cold came and added a proper bedroom to the small house, which he'd been planning since the spring and which took him and Saul Briggs, who turned up again at the precisely useful moment, apparently guided by some instinct for necessity, 3 weeks of Saturdays to complete. The addition was small but solid, and Ruth walked through it when it was finished and ran her hand along the smoothed frame of the new window and said, "Emmett, you built this." "Saul helped considerably," he said. "You built this," she said again, with an emphasis that was not really about the construction. She turned to look at him. "You built all of this." He looked around at what they'd made in 8 months, the crops, the house, the garden, the barn repaired, the curtains in the windows, the bookshelf along the parlor wall full of books and the beginnings of a second row. He looked at Ruth, 7 months along now, standing in the new bedroom doorway with the October light behind her and her hand on the door frame and her face full of the particular contentment of someone who is exactly where they are meant to be. "We built it," he said. She did not argue, which was the most complete agreement she ever offered. The winter settled in with its usual Kansas severity, and the baby came in February of 1880, a February that arrived with a week of bitter cold that had the whole county holding its breath and burning through the season's firewood at a distressing rate. Ruth went into labor on a Tuesday evening, and Hollies arrived by midnight. She had arrangements with a neighbor to ride for her at the first sign, and Emmett spent the night in the kitchen in a state of concentrated anxiety that he managed by maintaining the fire, making tea nobody drank, and performing every useful task he could identify, and then running out of useful tasks and having to simply wait, which was the hardest thing he had ever done. The baby arrived at 6 in the morning, a boy, healthy, loud in the way that announced good lungs, and a firm opinion about the transition from warmth to cold. Emmett was allowed in immediately, and he sat on the edge of the bed beside Ruth and looked at this new person, small and cross-looking, wrapped in the blanket had produced from somewhere, and he could not, despite considerable effort, find a single word for any of it. Ruth, who had just done the most difficult thing either of them had ever witnessed, looked thoroughly exhausted and entirely radiant. She looked at Emmett looking at the baby and said, "You're doing that face again." "What face?" "The one you made outside the schoolhouse when I told you yes." She smiled. "The one where you cannot believe your luck." "I cannot believe my luck," he agreed. "It continues to astonish me." He reached out and touched the baby's face very gently with one finger, and the baby turned toward it with the instinctive, disoriented faith of the newborn. "What do we call him?" "I thought," Ruth paused. "I thought Daniel, for my father." "Daniel Carver," he said, and the name sat well, heavy and right. "Yes." Mihalis, who was folding things in the corner with the supreme efficiency of a woman who has done this many times, said without looking up, "That's a fine name. Strong. He looks like a Daniel." "He looks like a person who is deeply unimpressed with everything so far," Emmett said. "He's got plenty of time to revise his opinion," Ruth said, and closed her eyes, and Emmett took the baby from her arms carefully and sat with his son in the cold dawn of the new decade and felt, with a completeness that silenced every remaining restless part of him, that he had arrived. The first years of the 1880s were years of construction, not just the physical expansion of the farm, though there was plenty of that, but the more intricate construction of a life that was genuinely their own. Daniel grew with the enthusiastic efficiency of a well-loved child, in a household full of interesting things. He was curious from the beginning, a quality that Ruth treated as an inheritance she'd passed on deliberately, and Emmett treated as a daily logistical challenge. Since curiosity combined with a toddler's lack of physical judgment produced a series of minor incidents involving the barn, the chickens, the kitchen garden, and once, memorably, the well, which they capped and covered with a new grate that Emmett built in a single determined Saturday. Ruth went back to teaching the following September, when Daniel was 7 months old, an arrangement made possible by Mihalis, whose youngest child had grown past the infant stage and who offered, with her characteristic directness, to watch Daniel during school hours in exchange for absolutely nothing, on the grounds that she liked Ruth and the baby, and considered it a social service to maintain good teachers in the district. Ruth accepted this in the spirit it was offered and repaid it in the form of regular suppers, preserved goods from the garden, and the unstinting use of her time and considerable intelligence whenever Me had a problem that required solving. Thomas Wren, now 11, had turned out to be exactly as remarkable as Ruth had predicted. He and his family were increasingly prosperous. His father ran a small but growing freighting operation, and Thomas spent his free hours solving problems for anyone who brought him one, which in a frontier town meant everyone. He and Daniel took an inexplicable liking to each other despite the age difference, and Thomas would sometimes walk out to the Carver farm on a Saturday and sit with the toddler in an attitude of grave mutual regard, both of them apparently satisfied with this arrangement. In the spring of 1882, Ruth told him there would be a second child. She told him in the same kitchen in the same morning light with the same direct simplicity that was utterly her own, and he crossed the kitchen and held her again, and she was steadier this time, the awe tempered by the familiarity of joy, a different kind of joy, no less complete but more recognized, like a country you have visited before and loved and know you will love again. The second child, born in October of 1882, was a girl. They named her Clara, after Clara Teague, the sheriff's wife, who had cried at their wedding and brought peaches and had been a consistent and generous presence in their lives in the years since. Clara Teague was moved by this considerably, though she expressed it by showing up with an enormous quantity of baby supplies and the assertion that she had been meaning to clear out the back room anyway. Clara Carver was, from her first weeks, an entirely different person from her brother. Where Daniel was exploratory and physical, Clara was still and watchful, with eyes that tracked everything in her environment with a thoroughness that reminded Emmett, with a startling vividness, of her mother. She would lie in her cradle and study the ceiling with the focused attention of a philosopher considering a problem, and when she eventually focused on a face, The quality of her attention was complete and genuine, as if she were deciding, based on careful data, whether the face was interesting enough to reward with her regard. Most faces apparently were. She was, despite her philosophical tendencies, an extremely sociable child. Emmett had, by the fall of 1882, paid off the note to Warren Hollies and formally owned the land he farmed. The moment Warren pressed the deed into his hands, a document that was not ceremonial but was entirely real, a sheet of paper that meant the ground under his boots, was his ground. Emmett felt something that he could not have named before the last 4 years but could now identify precisely: permanence. The sense of standing in a place that would hold him, that he would hold in turn. That evening he told Ruth. She was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing Clara and reading a letter from the school board about next year's curriculum, performing both tasks with the efficient multitasking he had come to regard as one of her most characteristic qualities. She set the letter down and looked at him. "Paid in full," he said. He set the deed on the table. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were full of something that was not tears. Ruth Beckett Carver did not cry easily but was adjacent to them, that brightness that precedes tears in people who don't let them fall. "Emmett Carver," she said, "you astonish me." "I had help," he said. "I had considerable help." She reached across the table and took his hand, and Clara, interrupted in her meal by her mother's movement, expressed her opinion of this with a small and imperious sound. And the kitchen was warm and lamplit and full of everything that had been built here. And outside the Kansas night was cold and enormous and full of stars, and it was exactly enough. The years continued to build on each other with the solid, unremarkable, and deeply satisfying weight of a good life in progress. Daniel started at Ruth's school, which was, everyone acknowledged, a social situation of some delicacy, given that the teacher was his mother, and managed it with an adaptability that gratified both his parents. He was not the best student in the school, not the best reader or the most diligent mathematician, but he had his father's reliability and his mother's directness, and a gift for getting along with everyone that was entirely his own. Clara, when she reached school age, was the best student in the school, a fact that Ruth handled with scrupulous fairness by refusing to give her daughter any preference whatsoever, which Clara responded to by working harder, apparently finding the challenge of earning her mother's professional approval rather than assuming it entirely satisfying. She and Thomas Wren, now grown and helping run his father's freighting business, maintained their improbable friendship. Thomas, who had never had much use for social convention, treated Clara's intelligence with the same respect he applied to interesting mathematics, which was to say completely, and without patronizing qualifications. In the fall of 1885, Emmett came across Ruth at the kitchen table late on a Thursday evening, when he had expected her to be in bed. She had papers in front of her, not school papers but correspondence, and the lamp was burning low, and she had the expression of someone deep in a decision. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. "There's a position," she said. "Not for me, for you." She pushed the papers toward him. "Warren Hollies mentioned it to me, who mentioned it to me. The county is looking to establish a land office in Caldwell, someone to manage property records, mediate boundary disputes, that kind of work. It requires someone who knows the land, who's respected in the community, who can deal with people calmly and fairly." She paused. "Me put your name forward. Warren seconded it. The letter came today." He sat down and read the letter. It was from the county office in Wellington, formal and straightforward. The salary was substantial, more than farming, certainly. The position was in town, which would mean moving back, or commuting, or he looked up. Ruth was watching him with the patient attention that meant she had already thought through all the relevant considerations and had decided not to share them until he'd had time to think for himself. "What do you think?" he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have built something real here on this land, and I would not ask you to give it up lightly. But I also think," she paused, "I think you have capabilities that the farm does not fully use, That is not a complaint about the farm, it's an observation about you." He sat with that for a long moment. The farm. His 160 acres, the crops, the barn he'd rebuilt properly in the second year, the drainage he'd cleared, the soil he knew intimately now, its particular composition and its specific needs. He loved it. He did not love it less because something else was possible. "We could keep the land," he said slowly. "Run fewer crops, keep the stock, rent the fields to someone who needs the acreage. Live in town, take the office position." "I've been teaching in Caldwell for 7 years," she said. "The school is mine in every way that matters. The children know me and I know them." A house in town would mean. She stopped and smiled, not the small almost smile but the full one, with the crease at the corner of her left eye going deep. "It would mean I could walk to school, which would be a considerable improvement over riding 6 miles in January." He looked at her across the table in the low lamplight. This woman who had come from Ohio with a list and a practical mind, and an inability to pretend she wasn't looking at the things she was looking at. And he thought of the square in Caldwell in October of 1878, 7 years ago, when she had come across the crowd to ask him a question that most people would not have thought to ask, and how that question had been the beginning of everything. "All right," he said. "We'll go to town." She stood up and came around the table and leaned down and kissed him on the top of his head in the brisk, affectionate way she had developed for moments when she was too happy to be appropriately dignified about it. "Good," she said. "I'll write to Wellington in the morning." The move to Caldwell took place the following spring, after the winter crops were arranged, with a young farmer named Hugh Pruitt who was eager for the acreage and reliable enough that Emmett felt comfortable leasing to him on fair terms. The house in town was on the north end of Maple Street, the same street as the school, which was, as Ruth pointed out with satisfaction, extremely convenient, and it was larger than the farmhouse, with a proper parlor, a separate kitchen, and 3 bedrooms that meant the children could stop sharing with the questionable privacy of a blanket hung between their cots. Emmett took up the position at the land office in June of 1886. He was good at it. In the specific way he was good at things that required patience, precision, and the ability to listen to people who were extremely agitated about things that were, at root, straightforward. Boundary disputes in Sumner County tended to be variations on a small number of recurring themes, and he learned to hear the theme beneath the particular outrage, and address the underlying issue with a calm that came from having spent years dealing with the much less manageable challenges of livestock and frozen ground, and the persistent uncertainty of weather. Clara, now 4, adapted to town life with immediate enthusiasm, attaching herself to the neighborhood with the social thoroughness of a small diplomat. Daniel, 7, was slightly more reserved, and Emmett noticed, in those first weeks, the particular way his son watched new situations with the careful assessment of someone who was not shy but was deliberate. He would observe something for a full day before committing to an opinion, and his opinions, once formed, were held steadily. He was like Ruth in that, and like Emmett in the deliberateness of the process, and the combination produced a child of considerable character. Ruth taught and managed the house, and read her books, and wrote letters to a widening circle of correspondence that included several other women teachers in the county with whom she had developed a running epistolary conversation about curriculum and what she called the particular challenges of educating in a territory that keeps changing underneath you. This was the 1880s, and the frontier was shifting. The wide-open spaces were filling, the old certainties giving way to new complications. She followed it all with her characteristic attention, and had opinions she was not shy about expressing. Thomas Wren, who was 20 now and running Wren Freighting with his father, came to Emmett one Saturday morning in the fall of 1886 with a look of determined composure that was his version of anxiety. "Mr. Carver," he said, "I would like to speak to you about Clara." Emmett looked at the young man, then at the doorway through which Clara had passed approximately 30 seconds before on her way to the kitchen. "Thomas," he said carefully, "Clara is 4 years old." Thomas blinked. Then his composure cracked slightly and he said, Yes, I know, I meant," he collected himself. I meant about her education. She's very bright. I've been helping her with her numbers and she's extraordinarily capable, and I wanted to discuss with you whether there were additional resources. Sit down, Thomas, Emmett said, not unkindly. Thomas sat. She's 4, Emmett said again. Yes, Thomas said. I am aware. Whatever you're thinking, Emmett said, I'd encourage you to think it again in about 14 years. Thomas Wren, who had never been anything other than entirely honest, looked at Emmett with the level seriousness that characterized all his engagements with interesting problems. That seems reasonable, he said. In the meantime, I'll confine my interest to her intellectual development. That seems very reasonable, Emmett agreed, and did not tell Ruth about this conversation for 3 days, at which point he did tell her because he could not keep it to himself any longer, and she laughed until she had to sit down, and then she said, Thomas Wren is going to be a very interesting problem in about 14 years, and Emmett said, he is, in fact, an extremely admirable young man, and Ruth looked at him with those clear eyes and said, yes, he is. I know. The years moved with that particular velocity that only becomes apparent in retrospect. The sense, looking back, that each year was full to its edges while passing, and yet the accumulation of years was somehow faster than the living of them. Daniel, growing up through the later 1880s, developed a passion for horses that was specific and technical. Not just the riding of them, but the management and training of them, the particular relationship between a horse's temperament and its capability, the science of breeding that was beginning to be discussed in the agricultural journals with increasing sophistication. He read everything available on the subject, and pestered every rancher in the county with questions that were always more informed than the ranchers expected from a boy his age. By the time he was 14, in 1894, he was working on weekends for a man named Garrett Sullivan, who ran the best horse operation in Sumner County. And Sullivan, a man not given to excessive praise, had told Warren Hollies that the Carver boy had a natural gift that he hadn't seen in 20 years of breeding horses. Clara was, as Thomas Wren had identified when she was 4 and her parents had both confirmed in the years since, extraordinarily intelligent. She read everything Ruth brought home and everything else she could find, and she had a mathematical facility that, Ruth told Emmett privately, genuinely exceeded anything she had encountered in 15 years of teaching. At 12, in 1894, she was doing work that would have challenged most adults, and the question of what she would do with her mind when she grew up was one that she considered with a philosophical seriousness entirely her own. Emmett at the land office was, by the mid-1890s, a known quantity in Caldwell and in Sumner County more broadly, a man whose word meant something, whose decisions in boundary disputes were accepted even by the losing party because he was scrupulously fair, and because he explained his reasoning in language that respected everyone's intelligence. He had not expected to love the work, but he did. It was, in its way, the same work as farming, understanding what was there, what it required, how to tend it for maximum good. The landscape was just people rather than soil. Ruth was 43 years old in 1895, and she was more thoroughly herself than she had been at any previous age, which was saying something. She had started writing proper writing, not just letters, but articles for the Kansas Education Journal about teaching methods in rural schools, about the particular challenges and opportunities of the one-room model, about her students over the years and what they had taught her. The first article had appeared in 1892 and had generated more correspondence than the journal's editor had expected, and by 1895 she was a regular contributor whose name was known to teachers across the state. She came home one evening in the fall of 1895 with that particular expression, the one where her eyes were bright and she was containing something. "Tell me," he said. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, which was where all their most important conversations had occurred, a kitchen table apparently being the furniture most suited to two people who are consistently honest with each other. "The State Teachers Association has asked me to speak at their annual meeting in Topeka," she said, "on the subject of rural education in the spring." He looked at her. This woman who had come to Caldwell with a list and a determination and no family left in the world, who had built a school and a life and a family and a reputation through the specific and consistent application of everything she was. "Of course you'll go," he said. "It's 3 days in Topeka," she said. "The children are 17 and 13 and entirely capable," he said. "I am here. We will manage. You will go to Topeka and you will tell those teachers everything you know, and they will be better for it." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Emmett," she said. "Ruth," he said. "I am very glad I asked you that question," she said. He knew immediately which question she meant. October 1878, the square, the crowd looking at the gallows and one man looking away. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She reached across the table and took his hand, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and outside the Kansas evening was settling into its particular fall quality, the light going at an angle that turned everything golden before the dark came, and Daniel was in the barn, always the barn, and Clara was upstairs with a book, probably several, and the house was full of the sound of itself. In the spring of 1896, Ruth went to Topeka and spoke to the Teachers Association with the same directness and precision that had characterized every conversation she had ever had. And she came home 3 days later with the particular luminosity of a person who has been exactly who they are in front of people who needed to see it. And Emmett met her at the train station with a bunch of wildflowers he'd picked from the creek bank, which was not a thing he had done since the courtship days. And she looked at the flowers and then at him and said, "Emmett Carver," which was how she said his full name when she was very happy. Daniel married in 1899, a woman named Sarah Porter, the daughter of a rancher from the southern part of the county, who had grown up with horses herself and shared his specific and technical passion for their management. The wedding was at the Caldwell church, smaller and quieter than Emmett and Ruth's own wedding, but deeply warm, and Emmett stood beside his son at the front of the church and thought of standing there himself 20 years earlier with his heart in his throat and Ruth walking toward him on Holly's arm. And the 20 years between the two moments collapsed briefly into a single point of reference: love, committed to in front of witnesses, the most durable thing two people can do. Daniel and Sarah established themselves on the Carver farm land, the original 160 acres that Emmett had stopped leasing, and instead offered to his son and new daughter-in-law as a wedding gift. Hugh Prewitt, the tenant, had been ready to move on, and the timing suited everyone. Daniel planted the same fields his father had planted, in better methods because the agricultural knowledge had advanced, and he ran horses on the south pastures with the systematic intelligence he brought to everything. Clara, who was 17 in 1899 and showing no signs of limiting her ambitions, had written to the state normal school in Emporia about admission, and had received back a response that Ruth had read twice and handed to Emmett without speaking, and which turned out to be an offer of a scholarship, a thing that the school apparently gave rarely and only to students of exceptional capability. Clara read the letter with the contained intensity of someone receiving information they had been working toward for years, and then looked up at her parents and said, in her precise and characteristic way, "I believe I will go." "Yes," Ruth said, "you will. We'll miss you terribly," Emmett said. "I will visit regularly," Clara said, which was how she said she would miss them too. Thomas Wren, who was now 31 and running a freighting operation that covered 3 counties, came to Emmett in the fall of 1899, not on a Saturday morning this time, but on a formal Wednesday afternoon appointment, which told Emmett immediately that Thomas had upgraded from 4-year-old to relevant subject of consideration. He sat across from Emmett in the land office with his hat in his hands and said, "Mr. Carver, I would like to speak to you about Clara." "She's 17, Thomas," Emmett said. "Yes," Thomas said. She's going to Emporia in the spring, and I am fully supportive of that fully. Her mind is extraordinary and it should be educated to its full capability. I wouldn't dream of he stopped. I wanted to speak to you before she left, not to ask anything. Just to, he looked at Emmett with the complete honesty that had always characterized him. I wanted you to know that my regard for her is entirely serious and entirely patient. I know she has years ahead of her, and she should have those years. He smiled slightly, the smile of a man who has made his peace with the particular mathematics of waiting. I'm just letting you know that I'll be here when she comes back. Emmett looked at Thomas Wren, this man who had turned from a boy who read books upside down and sang with perfect pitch into someone of considerable substance, patient and honest and reliable in ways that reminded Emmett very specifically of certain qualities he had attempted to bring to his own life. I appreciate you telling me, he said. I thought you deserved to know, Thomas said. Does Clara know? Emmett asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Clara knows everything, he said. She always has. Emmett thought of his daughter's eyes, that complete attention that had been there since infancy, the way she registered information and held it with absolute precision. Yes, he said. She does. Clara went to Emporia Normal School in the spring of 1900, the first year of the new century, carrying more books than luggage and a letter from her mother that Ruth had written in her clear, careful hand over the course of 3 evenings, and which she gave to Clara sealed, for reading on the train. Clara put it in her coat pocket and pressed her hand briefly over it, and if her eyes were bright at the station, the brightness was equally composed of joy and grief, which is the natural condition of leaving a place you have deeply loved. The 1900s began. The century turned over like a page and the world kept going, which is what it does. Emmett was 43, Ruth was 48, and their life in Caldwell was in its fullest expression. The land office and the school, the house on Maple Street, the farm 6 miles east where Daniel and Sarah were making something of their own, the network of relationships that 20 years in a place produces in the life of people who have engaged honestly with where they are. Ruth had a second book out, not her own book but a compilation she'd edited, a collection of essays by Kansas teachers on the subject of rural education that the state education department had funded and distributed to schools across the state. Her name was on the cover as editor, and when the first copy arrived in the mail she held it for a long time before opening it, and Emmett watched her hold it and thought of her standing in the schoolhouse 7 years into their marriage, her hand on the window frame saying, "Emmett, you built this." She had built this too. They had both been building and the buildings had both held. The letter from Clara came in the spring of 1902. She was finishing her 2nd year at the normal school, doing well in all her coursework, and she had something to tell them. She was going to marry Thomas Wren, who had come to Emporia in February, and who had apparently said things that she found both logical and deeply moving, and who had asked her with the same patient, serious directness with which he had asked Emmett to let him wait, and she had said yes with the completeness that Ruth recognized immediately as her daughter's fullest assent, not the partial agreement of a person trying to be polite, but the absolute yes of someone who has thought it through thoroughly and found no reservations. Ruth read the letter at the kitchen table, and Emmett read it over her shoulder, and she said, very quietly, "Thomas Wren." And then after a pause he waited 6 years. "He told me he would," Emmett said. Ruth looked at him. "You knew. He told me in 1899 before she went to Emporia." She was quiet for a moment, taking this in with the thoroughness she applied to all significant information. Then she said, "That is an extremely respectable man." "Yes," Emmett said, "he is." Clara and Thomas were married in October of 1902, in Caldwell, in the same church where Emmett and Ruth had married 23 years before. Ruth stood in the church with Emmett beside her and watched her daughter walk down the aisle with Daniel at her side, her only available male family member, since Emmett was needed at the front with the groom's party, and Clara was in a dress the color of winter cream, and her eyes were clear and steady and entirely her own. And Thomas Wren stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him with an expression of pure and patient satisfaction. The look of a man who has been building toward a moment for a very long time and recognizes it, when it arrives, without surprise but with complete joy. Emmett caught Ruth's hand in his at the moment Clara reached the altar, and she took it and held it and did not wipe her eyes because she was Ruth Beckett Carver and she did not easily cry, but her grip was very firm. The years continued to add themselves to the life. Daniel and Sarah had a son in 1901 and a daughter in 1904, and the children called Emmett and Ruth by the names that children use for grandparents, and came to the house on Maple Street for Sunday dinners that Ruth organized with her characteristic thoroughness, and that expanded steadily as the family did. Clara and Thomas had their first child in 1904, a boy, named after Warren Holly's with that man's gruff and pleased acceptance. And the house on Maple Street on Sunday evenings in those years was full of the specific beautiful noise of a family that has grown large in the good way, through love and work and time. Emmett retired from the land office in 1908, when he was 50, not because the work had worn him out, but because the right successor had appeared, a young man named Henry Foss who had all the qualities the job required, and who deserved the position more than Emmett needed to keep it. The county gave him a modest ceremony and an engraved watch that he wore every day, not for ceremony, but because it kept good time and he had always valued reliability in any form. He spent the first free summer in years working with Daniel on the farm, relearning the particular pleasure of physical work without immediate consequence. The kind you do because you love the land and the habit of it, not because the weather is about to turn and the crops must come in. He was 50 years old and his body knew every one of the years, but the knowledge was not regret. It was the record of things done, seasons worked through, foundations set. Ruth taught until 1910, when she was 58, and she stopped not because she no longer wanted to, but because the school board, in its continued penny-pinching wisdom, had decided to consolidate the schools of the district into a larger building in the county seat, and the schoolhouse on Maple Street was to be repurposed. She attended the last day of the old school with her final class of students, including a girl named Anna Wren, Thomas and Clara's eldest, who was 6 and had her father's mathematical certainty and her mother's clear-eyed attention and a quality of her own that was still being determined. And she spoke to the children with the directness and warmth that had characterized everything she had ever done in that room, and she told them what she knew about learning, which was that the most important thing was not the content but the habit, the practice of paying attention, asking the question, not looking away from what was difficult. She locked the schoolhouse for the last time and put the key in her pocket and walked home to Maple Street in the October light, the same month of October in which she had arrived, 31 years before. Emmett was on the porch. She came up the steps and stood beside him and looked out at the street, and then at the houses, and then at the sky, which was doing the October thing she had loved since her first October here, the particular blue that Kansas puts up in that month, enormous and clear and almost luminous. 31 years, she said. Yes, he said. Do you remember the square, she said. The first day. I remember everything about that day, he said. I have never forgotten a day of it. She looked at him. He looked at her 58 years old, her red hair fully silver now, her face carrying every year they had lived in lines that were familiar to him as the lines in the landscape he had farmed, the maps he had managed. She was more entirely herself than she had ever been, and she was entirely his, and he was entirely hers, and the specific miracle of that two people can manage to find each other and stay found was no less miraculous to him at 56 than it had been at 31 in a square in Caldwell, Kansas, on an October day when a woman had crossed a crowd to ask him a question. I am very glad I looked away, he said. She understood immediately. She always understood immediately. "I am very glad you did," she said. She took his arm, and they stood on the porch in the October light, and the town moved around them with the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon. Someone's wagon going down the street, a child running from one house to another, a dog debating the urgency of something in the neighbor's yard. And it was the world, continuing, full and ordinary and beautiful in exactly the way it is when you have paid enough attention to see it. In the years that followed, they became, without planning it, the kind of old couple that a community accumulates as a natural resource, the ones you go to with the problems that require patience and perspective, the ones who can tell you what the hard thing felt like from the other side of it, the ones whose house is always warm and whose kitchen table is always available. Ruth wrote when she wasn't advising people on educational matters. Emmett tended the kitchen garden and the small stable with the same methodical love he had brought to the farm, and went with Daniel to look at horses on Saturday mornings, with the pleasure of a man who has passed something he loved to someone he loves. Thomas and Clara built a house on the east side of Caldwell, larger than the house on Maple Street, but in the same street because Clara had thought about it and determined that proximity to her parents was a value she intended to preserve. She taught at the new consolidated school, carrying the inheritance of her mother's method and the specific texture of her own gift. And Thomas ran Wren freighting with the systematic intelligence that had characterized everything he'd done since the age of 9. Anna Wren, Clara and Thomas's eldest, was the kind of child who sits beside old people and actually listens, and she sat beside Emmett and Ruth on the porch in the summer evenings of the 1910s, with her father's mathematical steadiness and her mother's attention, and asked them, in her careful way, about things that had happened before she was born. She was particularly interested in how Emmett and Ruth had met, and Ruth told her the story with the same precision she brought to all things. And when she reached the part about the hanging and the man who looked away, Anna looked at Emmett with the fullness of attention that was her family inheritance and said, "And you had known him. That's why you couldn't watch." "Yes," Emmett said, "and she came to ask you why." "She did. And you told her." "I did." Anna considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's the important part," she said, "that you told her." Emmett looked at Ruth, who was looking at him, and the look between them carried the weight and warmth of nearly 4 decades of telling each other things honestly, without calculation, without the management of appearances. "Yes," he said, "that's the important part." The last spring Emmett wrote about in the journal he had kept irregularly since 1885, recording the farm, and then the land office, and then simply the days, as they went, was the spring of 1920. He was 62 years old, and Ruth was 68, and Daniel had grandchildren of his own beginning to appear, and Clara and Thomas's Anna was 18, and going to the State University in Lawrence to study mathematics in a program that Thomas had found, and Anna had fixed on with complete determination. Ruth had written the letter of recommendation for Anna's application in the same kitchen, where she had written 100 letters over the years, with the same clear and decisive hand, and the university had admitted Anna with the scholarship she deserved. On a May morning of that spring, Emmett sat on the porch with his coffee and the Kansas morning around him in its early summer version, the meadowlark back and going through its repertoire, the smell of the kitchen garden's first growth, the sound of the town waking to its day. Ruth came out with her own coffee and sat beside him, and the morning was so entirely itself that it required no commentary. But he said, after a while, "Ruth." "Emmett," she said. "I am grateful," he said. It was not an adequate word for what he meant, but it was the honest one. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were the same, older at the corners, clear in the center, entirely direct. The eyes that had come across a crowd to ask him a question he had not known until she asked it, that he needed to answer. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The morning held them there, the two of them on the porch of the house on Maple Street in Caldwell, Kansas, where they had built a life from a question asked across a square. And the life was full to its edges, and the edges were solid, and everything they had put down roots into had held, and they were exactly where they had found each other and intended, without any further question, to remain. Daniel and Sarah came for Sunday dinner that afternoon, and Clara and Thomas came from 3 houses east, and Anna came from wherever Anna had been studying the library most likely. And the house was full of the noise and warmth of all of them, and the dinner table extended out into the parlor to fit everyone, and Ruth served the meal she had prepared with her characteristic efficiency, and Emmett poured the cider, and the afternoon was long and warm and full. When everyone had gone and the dishes were done and the house was quiet again, they sat together in the last light of the Sunday evening, and the meadowlark made one final passage through its repertoire before the dark, and the stars over Kansas were beginning their nightly appearance in ones and twos, patient and enormous and permanent, the way the best things always are. Ruth's hand was in his. His hand was around hers. The porch boards were warm from the day's sun. The street was quiet. Everything had been built. Everything held. Everything was exactly and completely here.